10th. And if we are rained out, we will be here in the auditorium. Rain passes will be made available as of Wednesday morning, but hopefully we'll be in the park. And now, without further ado, here is Dr. Joe Schwarcz with Science Demystified.
Hey, I saw some heads nodding almost to the beat. That's very good. Okay, let's get going. As many of you know, I'm a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, and particularly of this one particular quote, because it kind of encompasses everything that I do. The fact is that you got to have the facts before you have a theory, not the other way around, as many people are inclined to do these days. The world revolves around facts, or at least it should. But recently, of course, we have had a lot of disconnect there. We had alternative facts and all kinds of nonsense. Anyway, also, as you know, my background is chemistry, and I think that chemistry is the thread that ties all the other sciences together. Because if you have a good feeling for what molecules are all about and what they can do, the reactions in which they can engage, you have a pretty good feel for what can and cannot happen. So I think that chemistry should be in the limelight, but not everyone agrees with that. There's so many people, chemistry is the work of the devil. And the word chemical has become, unfortunately, synonymous with toxin or with poison. And people think that chemists are these strange creatures who are locked away in some laboratory somewhere, just thinking about what new cancer-causing additive to unleash on the unsuspecting public. They think that we are a different breed altogether. And they yearn for a chemical-free life and chemical-free products. Well, the fact is that if you're buying a chemical-free product, you are not getting a good deal, because everything in the world, of course, is made of chemicals. It's not a dirty word. So chemicals are not to be feared, neither are they to be worshipped. They are to be understood. But this is a difficult message to get across to a lot of people, especially these days. You know, we say that we live in the age of information, but unfortunately, it is also the age of misinformation. Misinformation is information that is just wrong, right? And unfortunately, there's a lot of this that is being circulated these days. And one of the most troublesome things is that very often it is circulated by people who seem to have legitimacy, who have degrees, in fact, even medical degrees. This critter is a physician. How she ever got through med school, I will never understand. Anyway, she was one of these, you know, COVID deniers. And she said that if you got the COVID vaccine, you better somehow detox yourself. And she had all kinds of ideas that the vaccine was actually an injection, as you can see, of biosensors, usually somehow tied to Bill Gates, who was wanting to monitor the whole world. And she even had a regimen of what to do in order to neutralize all of these toxins that were put into your body by the vaccine, including taking a bath in borax. I mean, that is as absurd as it sounds. And obviously, the cartoonists had a field day with that one. But that kind of nonsense was circulating widely during COVID. That just gave a license to all the lunatics to spew out their venomous nonsense. including Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, who believed that the vaccine was designed to depopulate the world. Who and why this was never made clear. And the nonsense just continues, especially when it's promoted by people who get a lot of attention because of who they are. For example, Paris Hilton, believe it or not, she's promoting a test kit to test your fecal output for bacteria to get a proper picture of your microbiome. Now, the concept here is not ridiculous. As you know, there's a great deal of research on the microbiome, which is the trillions of bacteria of hundreds of different species that inhabit our gut. And imbalances in these bacteria certainly can be problematic. And there really is research in trying to analyze bacteria that are in your poop. Your poop is, in fact, mostly bacteria, to see if it can be related to disturbances in the microbiome. Well, so far, there's no good study that shows that that can be done, but at least it's a legitimate undertaking. However, there are these companies who have already put the cart before the horse, and they ask you to send in a fecal sample, and then they will determine the composition of microbiome, and based upon this, give you recommendations on what to eat and what not to eat. Now, this is way beyond what the science has shown, but you can make it sound very believable because there is legitimate research in this area. It's just that these products are not justified. Maybe in the future sometime they will. One that I find particularly disturbing is this guy who calls himself the people's chemist. His name is Shane Ellison, and he, in fact, does have some background. As you can see, he does have a master's degree in organic chemistry. He really did work as a pharmaceutical chemist. But now he has gone over to the dark side, and he helps people ditch their meds to live young. He has become the proponent of a chemical-free lifestyle. Now, how someone who has a background in chemistry can get into this kind of idiocy is really, inexplicable. Whether it's depression, cancer, or belly fat, ditching the meds and living chemical-free is the single most important way to live young. Look what he promises. He says he's going to help you give up your blood pressure meds, your thyroid pills, your antidepressants, no more diet drugs, no insulin. I mean, think of this. Someone who is saying no more insulin to people who are on insulin therapy, because he says these are all chemicals, which of course they are, but he is promoting this idea that chemicals are toxins and that you should get rid of them. And this is from someone who has a chemical background, so obviously he has just found a nice scam to get over on people. With that background, it's not possible to believe what he says. So it's all a money-making scheme. How does he make his money? By selling supplements. This guy who wants us to be chemical-free sells supplements. So here it is, raw tea for testosterone, because he says the testosterone supplements that are prescribed by physicians are chemicals. He has this, which is an extract of sarsaparilla, which is a plant, which actually does contain some physiologically active compounds, but none that can be converted in the body to testosterone. Just ridiculous. Another supplement that he sells is this one, this pre-workout supplement. Look at that. Faster, higher, stronger in 59 minutes without chemicals. 59 minutes, not 58. Not 60. You have to have your workout at 59 minutes. And as you can see, You can buy all kinds of other supplements that are useless, but his is good because it's chemical free. What's in there? Well, you can see citrulline, tyrosine, hawthorn extract, yerba mate, huperzine. Obviously, all of those are chemicals. So this is just an absolute total scam. And this from someone who's got a background in science and more specifically in chemistry. But of course, when we talk about misinformation, we cannot leave out the champion misinformant, which is Mehmet Oz. Now, we've talked off and on about him in different lectures because he's always worthy of being dumped on, especially these days when he has risen to a pretty high position where he looks after Medicare, looks after the other, sort of public health things in the U.S. This is, as you know, it has become a huge quagmire. Anyway, we first encountered him when he used to be an irregular guest on Oprah Winfrey's afternoon show. And he was pretty good. He'd come on and talk about the importance of exercise, talk about the importance of eating right. He was a big promoter of broccoli. But then Oprah anointed him God and gave him his own TV show. So now you have a daily TV show, an hour long, that you got to fill. You got to fill it with more than telling people to exercise and eat broccoli. But still, when the show first started, it was pretty good. He would have these huge mock-ups of, in this case, the colon or the lungs, and he would walk you through them, point out things. It was really very educational. But then they figured who their audience really was. It was overweight, middle-aged American women who, of course, wanted to lose weight. And that's when all the miracle promotions started. There was the raspberry ketone. It was a miracle. And he was not concerned about using the word miracle. He used that all the time. But these miracles did not have very long-lasting power because the week after, there would be a different miracle. So the raspberry ketone would be replaced by green coffee bean extract, which was the next weight loss miracle. This, of course, was all nonsense, but he had a large audience. But where I got really ticked off by this guy was when he started promoting his homeopathic starter kit. Now, homeopathy is a very interesting phenomenon, and we've talked about this off and on over the years as well. Most people do not know what homeopathy is, and that I know because we have done all sorts of surveys. We've surveyed students, we've surveyed teachers, we've surveyed professionals, nurses, doctors. One time we even surveyed this audience. And I can tell you that the majority of people believe that homeopathy is sort of an umbrella term for all alternative stuff. They think that it's acupuncture, it's reflexology, it's herbal remedies, all of this. No, it is absolutely not that. Homeopathy is a 200-year-old pseudo-medicine invented by a German physician by the name of Samuel Hahnemann, who was actually a good guy. He went through med school in those days in Germany 250 years ago. I mean, what did you learn then? You learned how to bleed patients, how to purge patients, how to torture them until they said, enough, I feel better. That's what they learned. But he looked for kinder, gentler things. And one of the remedies that was available in those days to treat fever was quinine, extract of what they called Peruvian bark, tree that grew in Peru. The active ingredient was quinine. Of course, they didn't know that then, but now we know. So they would give Peruvian bark to people who suffered from fever, particularly malaria. But it was difficult to make a standard preparation of this. So he wanted to know exactly how much to give patients. So he actually became his own guinea pig. And he started taking larger and larger doses of Peruvian bark to see what would happen. And when he got a high dose, he developed a fever, just like the fever he saw in his malaria patients. And thus was born the theory of homeopathy, that is like cures like, that a substance that in a healthy person, in a large dose will cause symptoms, will cure those symptoms in a sick person if it is diluted. Totally nonsensical, a total non sequitur. But that's how homeopathy was born. So the idea was to take the substance that in a healthy person caused the symptom, dilute it by taking 1 drop of the extract, adding 99 drops of water, taking 1 drop of that, adding 99 drops of water, etc. A dilution of 12C, that is doing this 100-fold dilution 12 times, leaves you with nothing. This we now know because we can make the calculation because we know about molecules. They didn't know that back then. So they had no idea that after all of this dilution, all they had was just water. That was unknown to them. They didn't know anything about molecules. So whatever effect it had was, of course, the placebo effect, because non-existent molecules do not have an existing effect. But believe it or not, this is still with us. So they do all of these dilutions, take the final solution, impregnate it into a little drop of sugar, a sugar pellet, and that's how you get your homeopathic remedies. This is the homeopathic materia medica, as they call it, which has a treatment for everything. Now, some of it is absurd beyond words. For example, they have homeopathic X-ray. X-rays diluted 200 times, each time 100-fold. How would you dilute an X-ray? It's total nonsense. And if you take a look at what it's supposed to do, relieves itching or skin rash aggravated at night and in bed. But I suppose if you have skin rash during the day, it doesn't work. You have to be in bed. Well, the only thing I can tell you here is that what this is really aggravating is me and other people who know what homeopathy is. This is ridiculous. But not as ridiculous as homeopathic Berlin Wall extract. Why? Because the Berlin Wall caused anxiety. There's no doubt about that, right? And therefore, according to the bizarre principles of homeopathy, a diluted version of Berlin Wall should relieve anxiety. Of course, how you go about diluting Berlin Wall, I really don't know. It's crazy. Anyway, homeopathy is placebo. It's as simple as that. The major question, of course, that we ask when we discuss all this kind of stuff is, whom should we listen? Who do we believe, right? I mean, why should you believe me, right? If I wanted to, I can make nonsense sound pretty good, right? The fact is that in science, we go by the peer-reviewed literature. It doesn't mean that it is foolproof, because people are not foolproof. When a researcher carries out some work, writes up the paper, submits it to a journal, the editor of the journal will send it out to what we call referees, 2 or 3, who are generally experts in that field, who then will evaluate the paper and determine whether or not it's worth publishing. Now, usually it's quite an involved process. It is almost never the case that the referees will say, okay, publish as is. There are always requirements to clarify things, maybe redo parts of experiment. There's a lot of back and forth. And eventually a decision is made whether or not to reject the paper or to publish it. Now, there are many different journals in the world, of course, thousands of journals. They're not all equal. The New England Journal of Medicine, for example, which is the top-rated medical journal in the world, if you get something published in there or in Nature or in Science, you know that it's pretty good work, right? These journals generally have a very high rejection rate. The New England Journal, for example, will accept roughly 1 in every 15 papers that are submitted. It doesn't mean that the other 14 are not good. They're just not as good as, they're not the top of the line, but eventually they get published in other journals. But the big but here is that when you get a paper to review that's been submitted, you, of course, have to assume that whatever is described in that paper is all legit, that they did those experiments and they got those results. If someone is going to submit fraudulent information, you're not going to catch that because, of course, the referees can't redo the work, which took people years to do. So it will eventually be caught if someone, for some reason, tries to reproduce it. This is the classic case of that horrific paper by Andrew Wakefield in the British journal The Lancet, which first introduced this idea that measles, the MMR vaccine, causes autism. It was fraudulent data. He was trying to defraud an insurance company. But this wasn't caught until, other scientists tried to reproduce that, and of course they couldn't. But by that time, we had epidemics of measles, which now are mushrooming. And Wakefield, who had his medical license taken away in England, emigrated to the US, where, of course, he found a fertile ground for his nonsense. And, of course, it was soaked up by Kennedy, who is as big a lunatic as you can find. And now we have all the consequences of, the measles. So while in the scientific realm, we go by the peer-reviewed literature, the general public, of course, doesn't. And they're at the mercy of anyone who can put together a few words that sound reasonable. Like, Kennedy. Americans are being poisoned by seed oils. That's his latest thing, and you should replace it by tallow. Absolutely no evidence for this. There's absolutely nothing wrong with seed oils. How this character has risen to the top of the US health pyramid is really unbelievable. Well, of course, we know how it happened. He made a pact with the devil that if the devil got to be president, he would give him the position. And that's what happened. The devil also appointed Dr. Casey Means as Surgeon General at the bequest of Kennedy. This woman is really something else. Although she does have a medical degree, she quit her residency in otorhinolaryngal surgery. She said because she saw the light that Orthodox medicine wasn't giving results and that, she wanted to try what she calls functional medicine. This is a lot of crap. I can tell you from a lot of experience, nobody leaves a fourth-year residency in surgery because they saw the light. They leave because they get kicked out. That's how you leave a fourth-year residency position. And Dr. Andrea Love, who's actually an outstanding immunologist, really sees through this, and she has written a lot about Casey Means, who really is a grifter. She started out by selling all kinds of glucose monitors, but this is what you have in the U.S. now. Is that the lunatics are in charge of the asylum, and when you look at everyone who Trump has appointed, there's not one reasonable person there. Anyway, there are others. Anthony William, who calls himself the medical medium and is a New York Times bestseller. He's had several books. He's got a radio show in Florida where he answers medical questions. He has zero training in any science, none. He's a scientific imbecile, but he gets a lot of attention. He knows how to play the game. How is it that he has not been accused of practicing medicine without a license? Because he's got a clever gimmick. He says that he actually can contact a spirit, the spirit of a physician who died, and now he can contact him because he's a medium, so that the answers that he gives are actually coming from the spirit of this dead doctor. Now, why that dead doctor was knowledgeable in everything is another question. So this is how he gets away without being, accused of practicing medicine without a license, because he's just a conduit from the spirit world. He's just, translating the information. And that information almost always, no matter what the ailment is to drink celery juice. Now, you may remember 2 summers ago, the price of celery tripled. It was $5-6 for a bunch of celery. That was when his book came out. So it goes to show you how potent these people can be and what a reach that they have. I mean, there's absolutely nothing magical about celery juice. In fact, celery is one of the least nutritious vegetables. It is mostly water, right? So there's really nothing there, except for the medical medium. There's plenty of bucks in there. He's making money from selling his books. He's making money from the radio show without having any science background whatsoever. People also get their information from the social media. And I have some pals here too, like the food babe, Vanny Harry. In fact, she's the one who coined the term food babe for herself, which also says something, right? Anyway, but her hallmark, her standard sort of lingo, if you can't pronounce it, you should not be eating it. Well, I'm sure if I offered her some beta-fructofuranosyl alpha-D-glucopyranoside, she would run in the opposite direction because she couldn't possibly pronounce it. But that is just a chemical term for sugar, right? Now, there are many, many reasons to curb our intake of sugar, right? We know that. We've talked about that many times. But the fact that its chemical name is multisyllabic is not one of the reasons to give up sugar. Anyway, over the years, she has annoyed me, and I decided to do something about it. So I sent her 2 books. And sure, this, strangely enough, I haven't got a thank you from, from her. But just a couple of weeks ago, there she was on CNN, together with Marty Makary, who's the new commissioner of the FDA. Imagine that. They were talking about food dyes. Now, Marty Makary is a pretty well-noted cancer surgeon. Doesn't mean he knows anything about food dyes, but I mean, at least, he's got a science background. And there is the food babe on an equal footing. They're talking back and forth about the chemistry of food dyes and, how they should be banned, and about how they're made from petroleum. I mean, this is one of the boogeymen out there, that if something is made from petroleum, then it's questionable, which of course is ridiculous. I mean, petroleum is a source of all kinds of compounds that can be converted into the substances we use. Plastics are made from petroleum. I mean, many of our drugs are made from petroleum. And indeed, some of the artificial food colorings that we use do come from petroleum. But that's neither here nor there. We do not determine the toxicity or the safety of any substance based upon its ancestry. Doesn't matter where it comes from. What matters is what it is and what we know about it and to what extent we have studied it. Now, in terms of the synthetic food dyes, yeah, I would agree that we can certainly do without these. Not because they're made from petroleum, that's irrelevant, but because we don't need them in our food supply. They contribute nothing. they contribute cosmetics, right? It just changes the appearance of the food. And look at the foods in which you have artificial food dyes. Well, what are they? It's your Fruit Loop cereals, right? It's your Skittles candies, right? It's not your oranges and your apples. So it basically attracts, especially children, to foods that they will be better off not eating. So I'm totally in tune with controlling or even getting rid of food dyes, not because they're dangerous. I don't think they are, but because they attract people to foods that they should not be eating. But I'll tell you an interesting story about food dyes. One day, this is many years ago, I was speaking on the radio about a particular food dye, cochineal red, which is one of the more interesting food dyes. It is commonly used in strawberry and cherry ice cream because it gives a nice red color. And I explained where it comes from. It actually is an exudate of an insect. These tiny little insects, they mostly live on cacti, and the female of the species produces a red color when it's squashed. The male doesn't. So it's only the female that serves this purpose. Anyway, when I was talking about it, I explained that these were little insects, and I used an analogy, which, as it turns out, was probably not the best analogy to use. I said that these insects are smaller than a cockroach. Well, they are indeed very small, and when you squeeze them, as you can see, get the red color. The males are in there too. They're not separated. So the males are sacrificed for the beauty of the female. And, you squash them like that and you get this substance. Technically, it's called carmine. And it is used, as I said, in cherry and strawberry ice cream. So that's basically the way I told the story on the radio. And a couple of days later, I get a letter. In those days, we used to get letters. We used to get snail mail. I get a letter, and the lady wants me to confirm in writing so that she can show her neighbor that there are cockroaches in chocolate ice cream. Now, you see what happened, right? I used the word cockroach, and cockroaches are brown, and I talked about ice cream, so she put 2 and 2 together and got 5. Right, and all of a sudden there were cockroaches in chocolate ice cream. Well, of course, there are no cockroaches in chocolate of any kind, but you can see how this happens. If you're really interested, you can buy chocolate cockroaches. There they are. But you see what happened in this story. It was like playing telephone. You remember that game you used to play when you were young? You whisper something into one ear, and by the time it goes through a few people, it's completely different, right? There's nothing wrong with cochineal, but people didn't like the idea that it's an insect extract. They don't want insects. It's okay to eat the rear end of a cow, right, which is what steak is. That's not bothersome, but any insect extract, no. In fact, people were so troubled by this that Starbucks actually had to remove the coloring from this strawberry beverage they were selling because people didn't want to be drinking insects. Well, so it all depends on how you tell a story. You can scare people or you can relieve anxiety. But it's important to be scientific about that. I give you an example. Let's consider an apple. I mean, most people would assume that it's a healthy thing to eat, right? Well, when you bite into an apple, what are you tasting? This. About 300 different compounds. These are not pesticide residues. They're not additives. This is what the apple is made of, including formaldehyde. Now, you know what formaldehyde is. It's embalming fluid. This is what is used by morticians. And indeed, it is a potentially toxic substance. It is a carcinogen, a cancer-causing agent. Also in that apple, we have acetone. Last time you encountered that was on the label of your nail polish remover, right above where it says, do not drink. Right? Good advice. What else do we have in that apple? We have propanol. You know what that is? That's rubbing alcohol. And this really starts to rub people the wrong way. And you get the impression that when you bite into an apple, in fact, that apple is really taking a bite out of you. Of course, everything that I told you here is perfectly true. And if I stopped here, you could go away with the impression that there's a problem. But let me take you back to the cornerstone of toxicology, as was first voiced over 500 years ago by the great sage Paracelsus, who said that only the dose makes the poison. Yes, the formaldehyde is in there, so is the acetone, so is the rubbing alcohol. But the amounts are inconsequential, right? The dose is what is critical. You smoke one cigarette in your life, it's not going to do anything for you. You smoke 20 every day, different story. So it is with the acetone and the formaldehyde here. They are there in inconsequential amounts. So just because a chemical is present does not mean that it is doing something risky. That is a whole different story. Today, we can find the presence very easily because of the equipment that we have. We have our gas chromatographs and mass spectrometers that can detect down to 1 part per trillion. If you want a mental picture of what that is, it is the width of a credit card relative to the distance between the Earth and the moon. Okay, think about that for a moment. We can detect that. This is not finding a needle in a haystack. This is finding a needle in a world full of haystacks. So if you were told that there's one needle in one haystack somewhere in the world, would that stop you from a good old-fashioned roll in the hay? No, I think you would deem that the risk is worth taking, right? The fact is that our life is full of risks, no matter what you do. You can be out for a casual walk, and bad things can happen. Oh, don't go, oh, we're nice people, we faked it, they're fine. But they are not the innocent little creatures that you think they are. There is risk everywhere, and it's always a question of weighing it against the benefits. And if one substance turns out to be truly risky, and you want to get rid of it and replace it by something else, you better be sure that what you're replacing it with is preferable. We're seeing this all the time now. You know, you may have heard the controversy about a chemical called bisphenol A, which is found in many plastic materials. Well, it turns out that the replacement may be even worse than what you're replacing. Now, certainly there are some risks that are avoidable, right? And there are some interventions that may come with some risk, but the benefits greatly outweigh the risk. That's what we have with vaccines. I mean, no one ever in the scientific community has said that vaccines are risk-free, right? Of any kind of intervention does come with a risk, but the risk is very small. You know, even if there were truth to the link between autism and the vaccines, which there isn't. I mean, this has been categorically shown. But even if this were true, the benefits of vaccine would still outweigh the risks, right? measles, mumps, rubella, these are very dangerous diseases. These are diseases that you can die from. Also, we have to remember, we told you at the beginning, that there are no good or bad chemicals. They're just proper and improper ways to use them. And another important thing to remember, which I alluded to earlier, is that the effects of any substance do not depend on its ancestry. It does not matter if it was made by a chemist in a lab or if it was made by Mother Nature in a tree or in a bush. What matters is what we know about it, how we have studied that substance. There are some other important things that, though, to take into account when we talk about the risks. And one is consideration that children are not small adults. And a substance that can be safe in an adult can be a real problem in a child when the nervous system is just developing. Unfortunately, it is ethically not possible to do any kind of experiments with children. So you end up making guesses based on animal experiments and based on whatever data is available from adults. But you always have to keep in mind that children are a different species and they will react differently to substances. And the other extremely important thing to keep in mind is that humans are not giant rats, with obvious exceptions to that rule. But the reason that I mention that is because almost all toxicological studies are done on rats or on mice. And there's good reason for that. First of all, because you can experiment with lots of them. You can raise lots of mice and rats in cages in laboratories. They're relatively cheap to work with. And they will have to eat whatever you give them to eat. So, these are relatively easy experiments to do. And of course, you can test different doses. When you're testing for toxicity, you take some rats, inject them with small dose, other rats, larger dose, etc. You can do all of these studies. And then from there, we kind of extrapolate to humans. But it is not an totally safe assumption because we have different physiology from the rats. So it may be that there are some substances that are toxic in a rat, which turn out not to be toxic in humans, and also vice versa. So, toxicology is not an exact science. It is full of making assumptions. The other issue here is that when we do animal experiments, even animals that are closely related to each other may behave differently. For example, if we think of dioxin, which is reportedly the most toxic synthetic substance that exists, it is never made on purpose. It is always a byproduct of some industrial process. For example, when some plastics are burned, they will produce dioxin. Well, if you happen to be a guinea pig, indeed, it is the most toxic substance that exists. But if you're a hamster, you can frolic in it. And this is the same substance. Or consider chocolate. Imagine it did not exist. I know, frightening thought. But imagine it didn't exist. And here's this new substance, right? Natural substance. It's extracted from this bean that grows inside of a pod on a tree. And suppose no one had ever consumed this before. So you want to try it, right? You want to run toxicological tests on this stuff. So what do? Well, you can use mice or rats, or those are quite far removed from us. And they think, all right, why don't we try it on dogs, which are, closer to us? Well, if that had been the case, we would never have chocolate, because there's a compound in chocolate called theobromine, which is toxic to dogs. We handle it without any difficulty. Our liver and kidneys get rid of it. So we can eat as much chocolate as we want. And there isn't even a problem giving it to children, because it is a non-toxic substance, but it is toxic to dogs. And there are other things like that. Avocado, for example, is toxic to dogs. You also shouldn't give grapes to dogs. So, there are these physiological differences. Also, you have to remember that science can never prove that there's no risk associated with something. You cannot prove a negative, right? No matter what compound you're talking about. You can do all your toxicological studies, everything seems good. You can't prove that there isn't someone living in some shack in Siberia who might react to that substance, right? So you cannot prove that something cannot happen. And, there's the classic analogy that is so often used, and I've used it too, is you cannot prove that reindeer cannot fly, right? I think we would agree that it's an unlikely phenomenon. How do we prove it? I could take a reindeer, take it up to the top of this building and nudge it off. If ever that animal were motivated to fly, that's the moment. We'd have a mess at the bottom. You could repeat it with a second and third reindeer with the same result. What would you have proven? That those reindeer today, for some reason, could not or chose not to fly. You can't prove that there are not 8 reindeer somewhere in the world, given the right date, the right climactic conditions, the right words urging them on, that they can't fly, right? You cannot prove a negative. Also, you do have to understand that science is a complicated business, and you will always find divergent opinions. There are arguments about everything. As you know, there are arguments about climate change, right? And very often, a newspaper reporter will write an article on climate change, interview an expert on one side, interview an expert on the other side, and you get the impression that this is sort of a 50-50 argument that, but that's not the case. The fact is that when you interview climate scientists, 97% of them agree that what we're seeing is due to human activity. So it's not a balanced matter of opinion. You will find divergent opinions on everything. That's why in science we look for consensus, because there are so many studies coming out. There are 5 studies that come out every single minute of every day, right? That's an awful lot. Most of them are mediocre. Some are very good, some are very bad. But you can find a study to prove anything you want to prove. If you want to prove that tomatoes protect you from cancer, you can find a study. If you want to prove that tomatoes cause cancer, you can find a study. How can tomatoes cause cancer? Well, they claim the pesticide residues on there, okay? How can they prevent cancer? The antioxidants like beta-carotene. So the same thing goes for everything, except you will know bacon. There's no study that has ever shown that bacon is good for you, right? All the studies show that the problem mostly with the fat content, the salt content, and the nitrites. But the thing is that you can cherry pick your data and show almost anything you want to show. That's why in real science, we don't do that. What we do is shake the whole tree, collect all the cherries, mash them up, and give it a taste. That's how we come to some conclusion. But no matter what, it's impossible to predict all consequences of an action. One of the classic examples is back in the 1930s. Refrigerators ran on ammonia or sulfur dioxide. Those were the refrigerant liquids, right? You know how refrigeration works. You have a liquid that evaporates. As it evaporates, it sucks in heat from the fridge, and then a compressor compresses it back to a liquid and go through the cycle over and over again, and the motor that you're running is the compressor. If you had a leak of ammonia or sulfur dioxide, it was dangerous. Those are highly toxic gases. So they were replaced by the so-called fluorochlorocarbons, the freons, which are inert. They don't react with anything. They're safe. You can inhale them. In fact, the inhalers that you use for asthma, things like Ventolin, the propellant in there is a freon. So obviously it is safe, right? Who could have ever imagined back in the 1940s that 50 years in the future, that freon would be found in the upper atmosphere, destroying the ozone layer? How could you even think of something like that, right? So science is not foolproof. You can't predict all consequences of an action. But perhaps the biggest mistake that people who are not scientifically trained make is that correlation is not the same as causation. This is an extremely important thing to understand. In the summer, sunburns go up. So do sales of ice cream. But ice cream does not cause sunburn, right? I mean, this is an obvious thing where correlation is not the same as causation. However, sometimes it may not be so obvious. For example, if you listen to some of the alarmists, they will show you graphs like this. The increase in autism, which in fact is happening, not clear exactly why we are seeing an increase in autism. There are some theories on that. Women are having children at an older age. That can be a problem. Also, the criterion for diagnosis of autism has changed. So whereas before, kid may have been diagnosed as being a bad kid, and now he's, autistic. But anyway, there has been an increase in diagnosis of autism. So if you look at this graph, someone has put this together, relating increase in autism to the increased use of glyphosate, which is the world's premier weed killer. So you see this, it's a one-to-one correlation virtually, right? You can come to the conclusion that glyphosate causes autism. Well, this has been studied, and no, there's no relation. But you could also draw a similar graph linking organic food sales to autism, right? You have a similar correspondence because both of those have increased independent of each other. For different reasons, they have increased. One has nothing to do with the other, but nevertheless, you can have a correlation. So correlation is not the same as causation. You also have to remember that science is not a collection of unalterable truths, and certainty is indeed elusive. Things change in science. That, in fact, is one of the beauties of science. Sometimes and this is a true story, I've had this happen several times. Well, I'll have a student that I had in my class years ago, and after I gave a lecture, something like this one, and they'll come up to me, which is already disturbing because they have white hair, and but anyway, and they'll tell me, I remember when I was in your class 30 years ago, and you were saying vitamin E is potentially protective against heart disease. Now you're saying it's useless. So say, you see, you guys, you scientists, one day you say this, next day you say that. How can we trust you? Well, furthermore, 30 years is not exactly one day this, next day that. But also because since that time, we have accumulated a lot of information. Indeed, at first, there was this hypothesis that vitamin E could be protective against heart disease. But subsequent studies showed that it is just not the case. So we go with the flow. And, the flow now goes in the opposite direction. But that's the way that science is. Things change, and then we change the opinion, we change the advice that we give. So just because we change our minds does not mean that we're not scientifically minded. In fact, that is exactly what science is. So what's the overall message here? Is that we got to get kids early on thinking scientifically. It's never too early to start scientific education. It should continue through high school. Unfortunately, it usually is not very well taught in high school. But we got to get students thinking critically, knowing how to analyze data, knowing about the pitfalls of science, knowing who should be listened to and who not. We got to get rid of all of the BS that is out there because there is a great deal of it. We have to learn how to filter out the sense from the nonsense, which is, of course, what we normally try to do. So there's a glimpse for you into all of the misinformation that is out there and how to go about handling it. And I suspect that it might bring up a few burning questions. So we can give that a shot. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I can tell you there's no doubt in any scientific mind. The benefit of fluoride has been proven over and over again. It reduces cavities. And when you're reducing cavities, you're improving health, not only dental health, because if you have poor dental health, bacteria can enter the bloodstream more easily. Calgary is a very good example because they had banned fluoride. They saw a dramatic increase in cavities in children, and now they have reinstituted it. In the US, this is, again, one of the lunacies of Kennedy. It's just absolute nonsense. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Hard to answer. Some of it came directly out of COVID because indeed, some of the advice that was given during COVID was questionable. I mean, at the beginning, it was all about lockdowns and masks and everything, which logically was the right thing to do. When you don't know what is happening, you go to the extreme. Okay, well, it turned out that probably didn't need to be done. So in retrospect, they say, well, we couldn't trust them on this, horrific 2-year ordeal. So maybe the scientists really don't know what they're talking about. But it is also, very often the machine is run by the quacks who tend to make money off of the claims that, they have the answer that science doesn't. And it usually ends up because they're trying to sell something. I know a lot of this is inexplicable. It's just inexplicable. I mean, how can you explain that someone who has zero science background, is at the top of the US health pyramid? I mean, it's totally inexplicable. I mean, obviously Trump is inexplicable. So yeah. Yeah. I didn't get that. Oh, if you have dentures, if you have to take fluoride, there's no point. No point. I mean, fluoride is to protect you from cavities. You don't get cavities and dentures, right? Yeah. Yes. Misinformation is the spreading of information that you may actually believe is true. Okay, so you get some email and you say, okay, well, that sounds true. Let me just forward it to my friends, etc. Disinformation is the purposeful spreading of false information, usually for financial gain, right? So it is demonizing some prescription drug so that you can sell, quote, a natural alternative, but doing it purposefully, fully aware of the fact that what you're saying is not true. Yeah. Red dye number 3. Red dye number 2 is a whole different story. That was taken off the market a long time ago because some Russian studies showed that it was toxic, and the Americans said, what do the Russians know about red? So they didn't take it off the market. And then an American study showed also that it was toxic, and then they took it off. Red dye number 3 is the most recent one. If you look at the evidence for removing it, it's really nonsense, because the studies that they refer to were done 25 years ago with gigantic doses given to mice. No human would ever approach any dose like that. And even then, it was only in male mice, and the effect was very questionable. So no, it cannot be scientifically justified. It's all emotional. On the other hand, I don't have a problem with that, because we don't need food dyes, and as I said before, just cosmetic purpose. Why take any kind of risk with that? But the science does not justify removing it. The main problem with the food dyes, is that you find them in foods that basically are ultra processed junk foods. All right, so we'll see you next month, which I think is the first Monday of August.